Greetings. In this video, we're going to be looking at Kemp's jig on page 87 of the Christopher Parkening Classical Guitar Method, Volume 1. I'm going to glance at a couple of technique recommendations, but after that, this video we're actually going to take the time to look at how a composer would look at this piece of music, how it's constructed. So just to start, let's look at going into, where is this spot that was, oh, okay, here we go. Look at measure 10. If you look at the beginning of each line, there's a little measure number, except for the first line, under the treble clef. So we can quickly find a measure by just skimming the first measure of each line and then jumping to where we want to be. So if you look at that third system, you've got a little 9 under your treble clef, and then you just go over one measure, and that'll be your measure number 10. Now, coming into this guy, we want to get our pinky onto that D after doing this. Here my hand's in the second position, meaning that my fingers are aligned to each fret starting at fret 2, hence second position. If it's third position, then something like that. So, second position, I have this gesture of I go A, G, F sharp, and then I want to jump down to this D. Well, if we just try to pop onto that pinky, our pinky is our weakest and generally hardest to work with finger, and it can be really easy to miss that little jump. But one trick to that is once I'm done with my pinky, I go ahead and just place him on string 2. So watch this. I'm going to go A, G, and I go ahead and put my pinky here. F sharp, E, I slide up and hit that pinky. That gives me 3 whole notes, G, F sharp, E, to line up that pinky. So I don't even have to do it right on G. But if you can, sorry, I'm thinking about it and doing it and talking, and I get a little stopped up. If you can do that, then it's going to just train your fingers to anticipate the shifts that they need to make in order to hit fingerings like this. But I was practicing this and I was not hitting it as consistently as I liked, and so I took the time to find what's a way to make this more reliable. And I would encourage you, when you have a tricky passage like this, you need to stop and think very critically. Come up with solutions of your own. How can I get my hands to be reliable when I need to do this fingering 100% of the time? And I can throw suggestions out there all I want, but at the end of the day, you need to learn how to do this yourself. So this is an example of doing that, but I would stop right now and really take a passage that you're getting tripped up on and start getting creative and trying to come up with solutions of how can I hit this more consistently. Maybe I need to change the fingering. Maybe I can anticipate the fingering more. Maybe I can come up with a technique exercise to train my fingers to do this type of movement more reliably. But there's no substitute for critical thought. I'll do another video just on that subject in general. But that's a handy trick for that. I also want to mention the rhythm in measure 21 and 22. We've got a dotted 8th note going into a 16th note, right? We've got this F sharp, G, A. Now, a lot of people, when they're first starting to read music, they will read these as a triplet rhythm, bum, ba, bum, bum, ba, bum. Kind of like that country swing, bum, ba, dum, ba, dum, ba, dum. And it's got to be a little bit more snappy, tum, to tum, to tum. And the way to think about it, we're trying to do 1/4 of that time, right? If I were to do all 4 16th notes of a beat, I would go ba 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 bum. 1 2 3 4 1. 1 2 3 4 1. So you need to take the tempo you're playing the piece of music at. In this case, I'm doing something like bum 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 bum. There's my pulse. Okay? 1 2 3 4 1. 1 2 3 4 1. 1 2 3 4 1. 1 4 1. 1 4 1. And if you do something like that, you can listen to, when I do all 4, what's the interval of time into the next beat? 1 2 3 4 1. 1 4 1. It's a lot shorter than we normally assume. And that's something that the sooner you get this embedded in your reading, the more you won't repeat playing those triplet rhythms when we have dotted rhythms. They're very snappy and they have a great energy to them. If you play the rhythm correctly, it's going to create a different feel. And especially in Baroque music, it's really, really important to play those snappy 16th notes and get your rhythm tight. Unless it's a really flowing piece of music. But in this case, it's a jig, right? It's a dance. We want to keep that rhythm just cranking away. So watch out for that. Bum, bum. bum bum ba bum 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 ba bum. Also on that measure number 22 where we have that high D that drops to the A, it's tempting to hang on to that D. Don't do it. We want to have a clear melody that goes. Not. Just leaving him there undermines that A. But if I can. When you have a leap, our ear doesn't immediately want to hear it as melodic unless we can really cut off that first note. So watch out for that. Okay, so getting into looking at how this piece is constructed. It's a really interesting example. Let's go ahead and look at the first phrase, okay? So fortunately, the way that the music is arranged on the page, it conveys a lot of the structure of the piece very well. We have these 4 measure blocks, and that's very intentional. So here's our first phrase, 4 measures. Now, the next phrase is just a variation of that. So let's look at measure 1 versus measure 5. Okay, here's measure 1. Here's measure 5. It's basically the same thing. Structurally, it's the same. It's a D chord, A chord heading toward our B minor. And what happens with the melody, all it really does, if I were to really strip it down, all it's doing is going F sharp, E, into our next measure, D. That's really taking away most of the notes because we have some frill going on. The first measure, our melody goes. And what I'm saying is you could simplify that just to so the composer's taken this really basic concept and then he adds a little bit of embellishment to that. Now in measure 5 we add even more to that. So if you look at it, there's only 2 notes that are added between those 2 measures, okay? All that we add in measure 5 is an E and an F sharp. And then that G is even still on the very same moment in time. So just 2 notes difference. That little turn, it's going down so it has more room to come back up, just adds a lot more color. Now, basically the same thing happens, structurally I should say, the same thing happens in measure 2 versus measure 6. Here's measure 2. Here's measure 6. So there it's just adding 2 notes that just kind of, in this case, it's a note that fits in my chord. That's why he jumps down. And it's just adding a little bit of more movement, more texture, just to kind of fill it out and create some contrast to what he already did. And then we've got a little bit more embellishment on that line going up to measure 8, just as opposed to. So structurally it's the same, but he adds a little bit just to create a little interest. So that whole first line, the first 4 measures, are kind of a statement of the original concept. The second line, measures 5 through 8, are an embellishment of that. He takes the same basic structure and then just adds a couple embellishments here and there. And we get something that sounds different enough that it actually sounds like it's going somewhere. And fortunately, he doesn't repeat that content. If you were to keep repeating it, it starts to become tiresome and get old or feel like it's not getting anywhere. But he's just stating this original content twice. And then he's going to come back to that cadence in the end. And you could even say that your B minor and your D major to A major to B minor. If you look at measure 21, here's our D major. Here's our A chord. And then we've got our B minor. Now that's debatable. You could say that that's a D chord, and I would say that's a stronger argument for that. But it's still going something very similar to our original sequence. So here's our original kind of chord layout. 2, 3, Now here's the final line. We've got a D chord, a D again, which is very similar. Listen to D, listen to B minor. There's only one note different between those two chords, so they can be used pretty interchangeably and still sound very similar. So we've got D, hint at A, D, and then our A, and then kind of our contrapuntal little gesture back into, which is really a strong emphasis of an A chord. I worded that weirdly, but you can handle it. Back into our D major at the end. So this whole last system in the piece of music measures 21 through 24, is very similar to our original statement, and I would encourage you to think through that. So in the beginning, let's just title that statement, that content, statement A, okay? So we have A, and then we have A prime, okay, a variation of A. Then we go somewhere else for a while, and we do some other stuff, we experiment with some different musical ideas. And then the last line of music, we come back to yet another variation of A that ends exactly the same way as A prime. It's gonna sound like we're coming back to where we started. Imagine you start at home, and you go on a long trip, and you come home. When you get home, you get this feeling of having arrived at home. It's just kind of this like nostalgic sense that you get when you return somewhere. Well, music has the same effect. When a composer writes a piece of music and they present content in the beginning and they make it repeat enough that it becomes familiar, and then you leave it for a long time and then you return to it, you get that exact same feeling of familiarity or return. That's what's happening in this piece of music. It is varied enough that it still sounds like I'm going somewhere somewhat new. It's kind of like returning to the place, but maybe it's changed a little bit. But at the same time, it has a very strong sense of completion because we're returning to this original statement, and the ending is so similar. I'm going to play the last two measures of the first system, and then the last two measures at the end of the piece. Musically, structurally, it's the same. And it's going to be similar enough that it's going to cue the listener's ear to have that sense of familiarity. So this is how music really works. It's very structural. It's very logical. And when we as interpreters of music can understand how it's written and notice these sort of structural similarities or parallelisms or embellishments and things like that, we can know how to play the music in such a way as to make it more enjoyable for the listener. But it's also just intellectually stimulating. It's just enjoyable to see it and kind of get what's going on and understand it and get in the composer's head. It's very rewarding and it's worth learning. These are things where we need to kind of watch for melodies, we need to watch for harmonies, we need to look at sections of the piece. And the way we learn this is just by analyzing music. You just have to put it into practice. You start with something simple, you take on something a little harder, take on something a little harder, and just make a lifestyle of practicing it. I would strongly encourage you to regularly practice interpreting music or analyzing it. If you do that, at first it's going to be very difficult. I remember when I started and it was quite challenging. However, if you make a lifestyle of it, for example, let's say you were to take 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, in a couple of years, it's going to be vastly easier, and you're going to start to see things and your brain just starts to chunk information rapidly, or you see chords. You just recognize them instantly. You're going to start to hear this stuff more. It becomes easier. It becomes more automatic. You do something as a lifestyle and it starts to become automatic. Let's get back into analyzing this piece. So we have this parallelism between our first system, our second system, and then the final system at the end of the piece of music. So where does the third, fourth, and fifth system go? Let's have a look. It's kind of a neat gesture. So the third system, we have this gesture. And this is where I can prime my D. And then that whole gesture right there. So that was a little two-measure idea. I'm going to do this a whole step down and do it with C instead of D. And then we kind of work our way back into D. There's a 5 of D. You could say that, yeah, we're not going to dig into that. And there's our A chord to D. Okay, So we've got this 2-measure gesture in one key, key of D, and then we have this 2-measure gesture kind of repeated. The end is different, but we do it in C, which is weird because in the key of D we have a C sharp. So he's kind of doing a brief modulation, you might say, but it's just spicy enough to kind of have an interesting sound to it. I wouldn't say it's justified to call it a modulation. But you do a gesture in one key, you do the same gesture a little bit higher, a little bit lower. It's just a little composing trick. It's a really simple idea. But all you do is you take this one idea and you repeat it somewhere else, and you've got a whole line of music. That's what he did right here. And now, if we skip down to the second to last system, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth system, now we've got some embellishment on that idea. So we've got... And you could now play the original idea, measure 9. See how it's basically the same? Structurally it's the same. It functions the exact same way. It's just embellished. So there's a little bit more. It's unfamiliar enough that it doesn't sound like I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, but it's familiar enough that it has that kind of play on the original idea that I presented. And then we have something very similar, but a little bit of embellishment, as opposed to, just adding one F natural. And then instead of, we've got, oh, holy cow, it's the same. So that system's going to end the same as the third system. So you can see he's just kind of taking these same ideas and playing around with them. So what happens with the fourth system then? We've got this gesture. That's an even shorter. So measures, let's look at system 3. System 3, we have a 2-measure idea, and then we take that same idea and move it a little lower. 2-measure idea. Well, on this system, our fourth system, we have a 1-measure idea, and then we just do the same idea with a little bit of variation. Basically the same idea twice, but he just adds one note, and then we have our cadence that we keep hearing in the piece. Now, that system right there, system 4, has some similarity to system 6. Right? I'm going to play the first measure of system 4. Oh, wake up hand. First measure of system 6. It's basically the same thing. So, hopefully you've been able to keep up with this. I imagine if I were not experienced in analyzing music, I would watch a video like this and I would pause it every couple seconds to digest what the person is saying and look at the music and see how it applies. I know I'm blasting this information out, but for me this is the most efficient way to do it, and I know you can just tap the space bar and pause the video. So, in simple terms, here's what's going on. The composer's throwing ideas out there and then playing with those ideas. He might take an idea and then repeat it with some embellishments. Or he might take an idea and then do the same thing a little bit lower. Or he might take a shorter idea and then repeat it with embellishments. Or take an even shorter idea and repeat it with embellishments. And then I take something from here and I bring it here with some variation so it doesn't sound like I just repeated the same old thing. It's just totally interlaced and interwoven, and it makes a neat little piece of music. It's nothing terribly sophisticated, but it's a fun piece of music with some really interesting little musical ideas that are just, it's a great case study for looking at how a composer plays with musical ideas. It's not wizardry. It's something that anybody can do if they know enough about how music is written. So I would encourage you to analyze this piece. You can draw boxes and put arrows to things and just start to see how it's all interconnected. But what I was explaining earlier about that sense of familiarity that you get when you hear something and you leave it for a long time and you come back to it, that is very typical of composing music in general. When you write music, the structure informs the feelings that it creates in your listener. So that's what I want you to understand, and that's why I'm sharing this video. Is I want you to appreciate that music makes people feel certain ways for very specific reasons. It's not just mystical, it's structural, it's logical, it's very, very logical. If something creates an effect, there's a reason for it. So I would encourage you, if you hear something in a piece of music and you want to understand why you felt that way, or why it struck you a certain way, or sounded good. I generally have this rule of if something sounds good, there's a reason for it. And then you can look at the music and find out why. It usually has to do with just really clever part writing, and this note moves this way and this note moves this way in a really sneaky way to produce this chord to this chord. And that's usually what surprises me the most. But I would encourage you to learn to analyze music, and then take music you like and pick it apart and find out why it sounds good. It's not rocket science, but it does take work to get started. But it'll be very rewarding, and you'll be a better player for it. When you can look at music and understand what's going on, it creates a great deal more confidence when you approach that music. In addition, it's also easier to memorize, because you start to think, okay, I go to this A chord to this B minor chord. And then that kind of connects in your brain, and you get it in your head faster. So that was a lot, but I really hope this is helpful. I really think that every musician should learn to analyze music. It's something that everyone can achieve. It takes a lot of time and effort to get that foundation laid, but once it's there, it's a tool you have in your toolbox that's incredibly valuable. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching.